Hello and welcome back to Digging Deeper. Today we're looking at one of the more curious events of the experience in the wilderness where Moses struck the rock and water flowed. This lesson is entitled Speak to the Rock out of Numbers 20, and I'm sure most of you probably know the story where the people of God were complaining and grumbling against Moses for having led them out into the desert where there was no water. And of course, the rest is history. God told Moses to strike the rock, and they had water. Interestingly enough, biblical archaeologists believe that this here is the actual rock of Horeb, or that the rock that Moses struck, and it split open and water flowed freely. Um, One of the cool things about the possibility of this actually being the rock is that they have proven that the rock formations underneath it do show signs of water having flowed there pretty strongly. And so that's kind of cool. And in a picture, you might not think that's a very big rock, but when you put normal sized human beings up against it, you really get really get a sense of its size. So I thought that's kind of a cool thing to add there. So let's get into this real quick, excuse me, and look at Exodus chapter 17, verse 1, where it says that all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? His frustration is growing. They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take your staff in hand, with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So you get an idea here of what's going on. I already mentioned it in the previous slide, but I wanted to give you some idea as to how much water was needed. You have to remember that there was more than 600,000 Israelites in the desert. Not only that, there was thousands upon thousands of cattle and sheep and other animals that they were taking with them. So they needed more than just a sip of water. They needed more than just a bubbling brook. They needed a lot of water. And so when Moses struck the rock and the water came, many believe, by looking at the actual Mount Sinai location, that it actually created a small lake for people to get their water from. So that's pretty impressive. A little bit further on, a little bit later on in Numbers chapter 20, this whole event kind of took place again. There it says in verse 2, "But there was no water for the community, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. As the people argued with Moses, they told him, 'We wish that we had died when our relatives died in the Lord's presence. Why did you bring the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, so we and our cattle could die here? Why did you take us out of Egypt and bring us to this terrible place? There's no place to plant seeds, fig trees, vines, pomegranates, and there's no water to drink.'" So not only is this another instance of the Israelites complaining against God, but God had already proven to them his power to provide, and yet their hardened hearts were still in this condition. They were still complaining, they were still grumbling, and it frustrated Moses. Look there in verse 6. "Then Moses and Aaron went into the presence of the community at the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord told Moses, 'Take the rod, gather the community together, and then you and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock right before their eyes, it will release water. So what does this mean? If you look at the difference between those two passages, you can see in Exodus that Moses was commanded to, quote, strike the rock. And in Numbers 20, he is to speak to the rock with Aaron. Very striking difference, no pun intended. We have to look to see what in the world that could possibly mean. So that second time around, Moses was supposed to speak to the rock. What do you think he did? Well, it tells us there in verse 9, so Moses took the rod in the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the community together in front of the rock, and he said, pay attention, you rebels. I mean, at this point, you can really begin to see Moses' frustration. Moses told them, are we to bring you water from this rock? Of course, that was wrong, because it's God that is bringing water from the rock. Verse 11, then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. So here God commanded that he speak to the rock with Aaron. But in this verse, this time around, Moses took the rod and struck the rock not once, but twice. And again, I believe this was out of his own frustration with God's people, that he disobeyed God here. But God being faithful, the Bible tells us that lots of water gushed out, and both the community and their cattle were able to drink. Well, God wasn't very happy about that. In verse 12, the Lord rebuked Moses and Aaron, telling Moses, because you both did not believe me, because you didn't consecrate me as holy in the presence of the Israelis, you won't be the ones to bring this congregation into the land that I'm about to give them. So what God did here was God, because of this event, is telling Moses and Aaron that they are denied entrance into the promised land. They'll be able to see it, but they won't be able to enter it. So this is the reason that Moses was prevented. This is actually part of the reason that Moses was prevented into the promised land. And the other part we're going to look at here momentarily. But I want to explore this dynamic here a little bit, the striking versus the speaking. What could that mean? Why did God tell Moses the first time around to strike the rock and the second time around to speak to the rock? Well, we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is speaking, and he says, for I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers, that would be the Israelis in the desert, were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, the manna, and all drank the same spiritual drink, the water. For they drank from the spiritual rock at Mount Horeb that followed them, and the rock was Christ. So here Paul is telling them that that rock that Moses was beating on in frustration was actually Christ. A very interesting little passage. And the thing we have to understand here is that there is a messianic parallel to this whole story. In order for you to understand what I mean by that, we have to kind of go back into history a little bit and understand that the Jews hold to the idea of two messiahs, not just one messiah, but they hold to the idea of two messiahs. The first messiah is a suffering servant, Moshiach ben Joseph. Talks about him there in Psalm 22 and in Isaiah 53 and other places. The second Messiah, Moshiach ben David, was supposed to be a reigning king. And again, there in Isaiah 11 and other passages, it talks about them. So in their mind, they're awaiting two messiahs. One is going to be the suffering servant, one is going to be a reigning king. And the thing that they miss is the fact that there is one Messiah with two visits. And that's a striking difference. Christ, his first visit, was as a suffering servant, during which he was struck down, crucified. His second visit will be as a reigning king, during which we will speak to him. We will approach that throne freely and speak to Jesus. And that's what the rabbinic Jews are missing. They are missing the one Messiah with two visits. But to completely understand this, we have to come full circle back to Moses and understand the second reason that Moses was prevented from allowing the promised land. Let me ask a question. What does Moses represent? When we think of Moses, when we think of his time in the desert, what does he represent? Well, the answer is simple. He represents the law. It was through Moses that God handed down his law at Mount Sinai and delivered it to the people. And we understand as Christians that observance of the law cannot save. It only brings death. It's faith that saves through Christ. Observance of the law for salvation only brings death. Therefore, there is no place for the law in the promised land. Now, I say that tongue in cheek because did the Israelites observe the law once they were in the promised land? Yes, they did. But the teaching or the concept that observance of the law saves is obviously not true. And in that sense, the law has no place in the promised land. Does that make sense? So remember, Moses and the desert experience was a foreshadowing of the future. What I mean by that is the wilderness experience that they went through with God leading them to the promised land is equal to our life as Christians with Jesus leading us into heaven. So if Moses was prevented from going into the promised land for those two reasons, who did get the Jews into the promised land? Who ushered them in? Do you remember? It was Joshua, right? What does Joshua's name mean in Hebrew? Well, it's pronounced Yehoshua, and it means the Lord saves. Who will lead us as Christians into our promised land? Well, we know the answer, of course, is Jesus, and his name in Hebrew is Yeshua, and it means salvation. So I think it's just an amazing thing about God's word, where he has this play on words, if you will, that Yehoshua led the Israelites into their promised land, and Yeshua will lead us into our promised land. John chapter 4, verse 14 says, "Whoever drinks the water that I give will never be thirsty again. This rock in the desert that was Christ, the water that I will give him, will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." I hope this has encouraged you. Have a great day.